The room didn't erupt. It went quiet. That kind of quiet that doesn't feel calm. It feels heavy. Like everyone in the room knows something irreversible has just happened, but no one is brave enough to say it out loud. Because one sentence changed everything. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. A royal DNA secret has been discovered. Not rumored. Not whispered by tabloids. Not hinted at by anonymous sources. Discovered. And when the words finally reached the family at the center of power, the reaction wasn't anger first, it was disbelief. Here's the question no one wants to ask, but everyone is thinking. What if the royal story you've believed your entire life was never the full story at all? For decades, the monarchy has presented itself as continuity, bloodlines, certainty, a chain that could never be broken. Kings, heirs, destinies passed down with almost mathematical precision. You're born into it, or you're not. End of discussion. Except, what if that certainty was an illusion? What if a modern tool, cold, objective, scientific, was finally applied to a system built entirely on tradition and trust? This isn't just about biology. It's about identity. It's about legitimacy. It's about whether silence was protection or deception. When the couple at the heart of this story were informed, they didn't rush to microphones. There was no instant statement. No dramatic appearance. Instead, there was time. Too much time. Days that stretched into weeks. Conversations that happened behind closed doors. Questions that led to more questions. And a realization that once you know the truth, you can never unknow it. Ask yourself this. If you discovered that a fundamental part of your family story wasn't what you were told, would you feel relieved or betrayed? Because the words that eventually surfaced were not carefully polished. They weren't rehearsed. They were raw. We were lied to for decades. That sentence matters more than any DNA report. It suggests knowledge existed somewhere. It suggests silence wasn't accidental. It suggests decisions were made long before this moment. Decisions about what the public could handle, what the family could survive, and what truths were better left buried. And here's why this matters right now. Not years ago. Not someday in the future. Now. Because succession isn't just symbolic anymore. Because public trust is fragile. Because the world no longer accepts "don't ask" as an answer. And because once a secret like this surfaces, it doesn't stay contained. It ripples outward, touching history, legacy, and the very idea of legitimacy itself. But here's the most unsettling part. The DNA result wasn't the most shocking thing revealed. What truly shook the family was when they realized how long this question had existed and how deliberately it had been avoided. Because once that door was opened, it became clear this wasn't just about one test. It was about a truth that had been waiting far longer than anyone was ready to admit. And what came next would force a reckoning no one saw coming. The assumption was never questioned. That's what made it so powerful. For generations, the royal bloodline was treated like gravity. Invisible, unquestioned, absolute. You didn't test it. You didn't verify it. You simply accepted it. Because the entire institution depended on that acceptance. Here's the uncomfortable question. How many things do we believe simply because we're told they've always been true? For centuries, legitimacy in the monarchy wasn't proven by science. It was proven by ceremony, by witnesses, by carefully documented births, by sealed letters and trusted officials. The system worked because everyone agreed it worked. Tradition filled the gaps where certainty should have lived. But tradition has a weakness. It assumes honesty forever. As time passed, science evolved. The world changed. DNA testing became routine, casual, unremarkable. People discovered siblings they never knew existed. Fathers who weren't who they thought. Entire family trees quietly redrawn by a saliva sample and a lab report. And yet, inside the palace, the old assumption held firm. Royal blood was untouchable. Until it wasn't. The first crack didn't come from rebellion. It didn't come from scandal. It came from curiosity mixed with caution. A question that started small, private, almost academic. A hypothetical that lingered just long enough to become uncomfortable. What if? Not an accusation. Not a challenge. Just a question. And questions are dangerous in systems built on certainty. At first, it was dismissed. Then delayed. Then carefully sidestepped. Because answering it meant risking something far bigger than embarrassment. It meant risking history itself. Think about that pressure. If you're wrong, you destabilize nothing. If you're right, you destabilize everything. So silence became the safest option. Years passed. Decades, even. The assumption solidified again, reinforced by time. But beneath it, doubt never fully disappeared. It simply went dormant, waiting for a moment when it could no longer be ignored. That moment arrived quietly. No public announcement. No press leak. Just a decision made behind closed doors that the question could no longer remain theoretical. That the world had changed enough. That avoiding the truth had become more dangerous than facing it. And once that decision was made, there was no turning back. Because science doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't care about titles. It doesn't care about crowns. It only answers the question you ask. Here's the irony no one talks about. The test itself wasn't the threat. The threat was what it represented. An admission that certainty had always been assumed, never proven. And once that realization set in, fear followed close behind. Fear of what the answer might be. Fear of who it might affect. Fear of what would happen if the assumption collapsed under scrutiny. Ask yourself honestly, if your entire family legacy rested on something no one ever verified, would you want to verify it now? Because the moment the test was ordered, the monarchy crossed an invisible line. A line between belief and evidence. Between story and fact. And when the results came back, they didn't just answer a question. They exposed how fragile certainty had always been. But the most unsettling part wasn't the science. It was realizing how long the truth had been waiting, and how many people had quietly hoped it would never be asked. Because what happened after the results surfaced didn't bring clarity. It brought silence. And that silence spoke louder than any announcement ever could. The delay was the loudest response of all. Not the test. Not the science. Not even the result. The waiting. Days passed after the information surfaced. Then more days. No statement. No denial. No reassurance. Just a strange, calculated quiet that felt heavier than panic. Because when institutions move fast, they're confident. When they slow down, they're afraid. Ask yourself this. If the truth changes nothing, why hesitate to speak? Inside the walls, the mood shifted. What had once been theoretical became immediate. Conversations that were supposed to be brief stretched into hours. Simple questions turned into emotional landmines. Every sentence had consequences now. Who needs to know? How much do they need to know? And what happens if they find out before we're ready? This wasn't just a logistical problem. It was moral. Because delaying the truth isn't neutral. It's a choice. And every day of silence added weight to that choice. Here's the contradiction that tore through everything. The truth was supposed to bring resolution. Instead, it created paralysis. Because the moment the result existed, everyone realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about confirming facts. It was about rewriting meaning. About identity. About whether people had been living inside a story that wasn't fully theirs. Think about discovering that your place in the world was built on an assumption someone else made long before you were born. Not out of malice, maybe, but out of fear. Out of convenience. Out of a belief that protecting the system mattered more than questioning it. That's not relief. That's disorientation. And then came the conversations no one ever expects to have. Quiet ones. Careful ones. The kind where every word feels like it could crack something fragile. There were arguments. Not loud ones, controlled ones. The kind that hurt more because no one raises their voice. The kind where people say, we need to think, when they really mean, we're scared. Because here's the truth no press release will ever admit. The danger wasn't exposure. The danger was implication. If this secret existed, what else had been quietly managed? If silence was justified once, why not again? And if truth could be delayed for decades, what does that say about trust? The longer the delay stretched, the clearer it became that the problem wasn't how to tell the public. It was how to live with the knowledge internally. Imagine knowing something that reframes your past, but being asked to continue forward as if nothing changed. Smiling in public, performing tradition, standing in ceremonies that now feel slightly off balance. That kind of tension doesn't fade. It compounds. And then came the realization that changed the tone completely. The silence itself was becoming the story. Because in a world obsessed with transparency, quiet looks like guilt. Delay looks like calculation. And calculation looks like intent. At some point, someone asked the question no one wanted to answer. What if the damage is already done? Because the longer the truth stayed contained, the more explosive it would become when it finally surfaced. And when it did, it wouldn't just reveal a fact. It would expose the silence surrounding it. And that's when everything shifted, because the conversation stopped being about whether to speak. It became about who would be blamed when the truth could no longer be held back. And that realization changed the stakes entirely, in ways no one inside those rooms was prepared for. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. We were lied to for decades. Not shouted, not dramatized, spoken flat, almost quietly. And that's what made it devastating. Because that statement wasn't aimed at the media. It wasn't even aimed at the public. It was aimed inward. At the past, at the rooms where decisions were made, at people who believed silence was kindness. Here's the question that cuts deepest. Who lies for decades without convincing themselves it was necessary? That line wasn't born from anger. It came from grief. From the sudden realization that the story you were raised inside wasn't just incomplete, it was curated. That pieces were removed not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. And suddenly, the truth stopped being abstract. It became personal. Think about it. If you're told something your entire life, about who you are, where you belong, what your future represents, and then you discover parts of that story were withheld, it doesn't just change facts. It changes memory. You start replaying moments differently. Conversations, decisions, assurances that now feel conditional. Was I protected? Or was I managed? That's the contradiction tearing through this moment. Those who kept the secret likely believed they were preserving stability, avoiding chaos, protecting the institution. But protection without consent becomes deception. And deception, no matter how well-intentioned, erodes trust. Slowly at first, then all at once. Here's the irony no one wants to confront. The lie didn't protect the next generation. It burdened them. It handed them a truth delayed so long that it arrived already poisoned by silence. And that's why the statement mattered. Because it reframed the narrative. This wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about blame. It was about inheritance, not of titles, but of choices. The people affected weren't accusing the past of cruelty. They were accusing it of control, of deciding that some people didn't deserve the full truth about their own lives. Ask yourself honestly, if someone withheld the truth from you for your own good, would you thank them or resent them? That question hung in the air, unanswered. Because once you admit you were lied to, another realization follows close behind. Trust doesn't reset automatically. It fractures, and fractures don't always heal cleanly. This wasn't a single secret uncovered. It was a pattern revealed, a culture of deciding what others could handle. And once that pattern is visible, it changes everything: relationships, authority, legitimacy. Suddenly, the conversation expanded beyond DNA. It became about power. Who decides what truth is too dangerous? Who gets to carry it? And who lives inside the consequences of not knowing? The line of succession, the legacy, the image, all of it suddenly felt less solid. Not broken yet, but unsettled. Like a structure you realize was built on assumptions rather than foundations. And here's the part no one expected. The fallout didn't begin with the public. It began within the family. Because when trust breaks internally, it doesn't stay contained. It shifts loyalties. It changes how people listen to each other. It alters what they're willing to accept going forward. And the next question wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. Because if one truth was delayed for decades, what happens to the next one? And that question would force a decision that no one could avoid. One that would move this story beyond words and into consequences. The truth didn't explode the way people expected. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. No dramatic unraveling. No instant rewriting of history. What happened instead was quieter and far more unsettling. Reality shifted. Slowly, subtly, permanently. Remember the question from the very beginning. What if the royal story you've believed your entire life was never the full story? By the time this moment arrived, that question no longer felt theoretical. It felt lived in. Heavy. Like a realization that settles into your chest and refuses to leave. Because the truth didn't just challenge lineage, it challenged trust. And trust, once fractured, doesn't respond to ceremony or tradition. It responds to honesty. That's the emotional core of what's unfolding now. This isn't a battle between science and monarchy. It's a reckoning between silence and transparency. between the past's instinct to protect and the present's demand to know. Think about how many decisions were made under assumptions that now feel unstable. How many conversations were shaped by a version of reality that wasn't complete? How many expectations were inherited without consent? That's the weight of delayed truth. And here's the part that matters most going forward. The family didn't just learn something new. They learned something old, something that had existed quietly in the shadows while generations moved forward unaware. That realization changes how you look at everything else. Because once one truth surfaces, it invites another. And another. It forces a question that institutions fear more than scandal. What else was managed instead of shared? The irony is painful. The very secrecy meant to preserve stability may end up weakening it. Not because the truth is catastrophic, but because withholding it was. And yet, this moment also carries possibility. Because confronting truth doesn't erase legacy. It humanizes it. It reminds us that even the most powerful institutions are built by people. Flawed, fearful, well-intentioned people who made choices under pressure. But the next generation doesn't have the same luxury. They inherit the consequences. So the real story here isn't about what was discovered. It's about what happens next. About whether honesty becomes the new foundation, or whether silence simply adapts and survives in a different form. Ask yourself this. If you were handed the truth after decades of delay, would you protect the system that hid it? Or change the system so it could never happen again? That decision hasn't been publicly revealed yet. And that's why this moment isn't an ending. It's a beginning. Because the DNA secret may have been discovered, but the legacy of how it's handled will define everything that follows. And the next move, the one being debated right now behind closed doors, will tell us whether this story becomes a turning point, or just another secret waiting to surface.